We are St Mary's Church, Church of Ireland in Maynooth. We are part of the International Anglican Communion. And men, women and children have worshipped on this site for over 800 years. I bet that many of you have passed down Parson Street over the years and have wondered what the inside of the church is like. Well, now is your opportunity to see the inside, to see some of our artefacts and get a flavour of the historical significance and really just the plain simple beauty of this wonderful church. Welcome to St Mary's Church, Maynooth. If you've ever had the pleasure of coming in here, you'll see how special a place it is. This year, for Culture Night, we can't have people come through the doors. You see, last year we actually had a lovely variety concert, and we had roughly about 250 to 280 people visit us for a short or a longer period of time on the night. And we had some traditional music, we had brass band, we had some church music and some secular music and some organ music. A little bit there for everybody. Unfortunately, because of the restrictions placed upon us because of the COVID-19, we can't do that this year. However, what I have done is put together a short video to show you the inside, a little bit about the history, and a little bit about what makes this place so special. My name is Reverend Eugene Griffin, and I'm rector here in St Mary's. And back in March 2018, I came here as rector, and on the night before I was instituted, I got in to see the church and I immediately fell in love with it. I love churches that have exposed brickwork, that have beautiful organs, that have a simplicity, but a sincerity and a very spiritual place in the community. I feel that that is really what St Mary's is about. On a Sunday, when I get up to lead a service or preach, I always have in my mind's eye the many, many people down through the centuries who have sat in the pews. I also think of all those who have gone before me as rector here. It really is humbling to feel that you are just part of a relay race, that we all hand on the baton to one another as time goes on. St Mary's has been described by somebody very recently to me as a little jewel in the crown. It is a jewel indeed. I absolutely adore the place, and I know the parishioners do too. The black door that you see at the entrance to the church is the original door. However, in 2019, it was taken off and repurposed and rehung, and to make it fit for the years to come. The plaque on the inside of the portico is to remind us that the Fitzgerald family played a huge part in the founding of this church, and that some of their family members are buried in the Mausoleum at the back. The medieval font was a gift to St Mary's from the Church of Ireland Church in Kilcock. The Telford organ was built by Telford and Telford in 1820. They also built organs for St Patrick's Cathedral and for Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. The pulpit was built in honour of Reverend George Draker Blackers, a former rector of Maynooth. The church that you see here is not the same inside as it was in years gone by. Like a lot of older churches, there were damp problems and problems with paintwork and things like that over the years. Back in the 1990s, some concerned and very fit and hardy parishioners came together and they had a mini project in mind. And for 5 years, they stripped back all the plasterwork and paintwork to expose the beautiful natural stone. This plaque is dedicated in honour of them, just like this video tonight.
It's a real pleasure to be outside the walls of St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. I entered there in 1963 as a student of the seminary, and I left in 1967. And then life worked out such that I was involved in the heritage of Maynooth and documenting the heritage and the people in its college cemetery. But I never really thought too much about how we might tell the story of this building that comes into the campus of Maynooth in such an impressive way. And that if people pass, surely they must ask, what is the story of this fine church building? And I suppose the one thing we have to say about it, and I'm not really a historian, I'm more an observer and a writer and a documenter, is that it is the one place in Maynooth where Christian worship has been carried on semi-continuously for the longest time. We're going back to about the year probably 1200, when it was established by the Fitzgerald dynasty, when the castle was built. We do not know exactly the original footprint of the castle, but we do know that over time and in the various rebuildings of the castle in the 13th century and the 15th century, there was a church in the corner of the castle encampment. And that castle, therefore, stretched from where the ruins are outside the church, as you observe, to the keep that is here, that is now part of the church and that forms also the place of burial of members of the Fitzgerald family. So we do know that the castle, when it was built, was a very formidable establishment. It had a hall with a kitchen, it had a second thatch-covered hall, a bakehouse, a vault, a grange, a cow byre, a stable, a turret, a ditch, a garden gate, a haggard gate, a dovecote, and a mill, all within the enclosure. And there in the corner was their little church. But you can imagine that going in and out of the church was probably confined to the people who worked in the castle. And even if you got in and out of the church, the surrounding hubbub must have been quite upsetting and intrusive. But they didn't mind it in those days. In 1426, I believe, we had the first real enlargement of the castle, which meant that ultimately you had 4 large towers on the corner and an entrance probably a little down from the main entrance to Maynooth, which is the main gate into the castle. It had, by the early 1500s, a famous library. That was one of the most impressive things about the early days of the encampment, that the church was associated with a library that was well known. And then in 1518, of course, and we don't know exactly what changes were made to the fabric of the buildings, a college was established, the College of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And this was quite a formidable establishment with a list of various people who might be employed there. It didn't last very long because in the ructions that surrounded the Reformation, there was a siege of the castle. The castle was damaged, and though it was repaired and restored to the Fitzgerald, it really never got back its full life as an establishment. In the 1600s, when the Earl of Kildare got married, he married a daughter of the Earl of Cork, and the Earl of Cork took it upon himself then to rebuild the castle. And at that time, we believe in the 1600s, the church was also rebuilt. But then in the Catholic supremacy that lasted for maybe about 20 years, the library was plundered, and the church, we believe, was also destroyed in that time or made unusable. But we do know that during that time, there was quite an establishment here. Still, people, even though the castle wasn't functioning, people came in and lived around the castle, and that was a feature of life for many centuries after that. That it became, instead of being kind of an enclosed building, it became more of a dispersed building with buildings in ruins and houses built in between the ruined buildings. So in 1647, we know that that was at its height, that kind of bad use of the area, and the church itself was condemned, it says here, to base uses. There was something like distilling going on here, which in those days might have been a very big sin. But by the turn of the century then, we come into 1700, the population of the village was probably about 300. The ruins were still there, they were not inhabited, there were small houses around them and between them, and behind was a council house, the remains of the old Fitzgerald meeting place, which was actually being used as a dwelling house and had a little park behind it of about 60 acres. So in 1691 then the whole property was forfeited in the Williamite and Jacobite Wars, and then we turn into 1700, and in 1700 things became very relatively peaceful, even though it was a period of the penal laws. Houses became looked like houses rather than castles. They didn't need to defend themselves that much. And in 1703, Carton, which is at the other end of the village and was to have a major influence on church affairs and civic affairs, was purchased by the Inglesby family. And they didn't stay in it very long, but in 1739, the 19th Earl of Kildare bought the lease of Carton, bought a house in Dublin, and hired an architect to begin on renovating and developing and rebuilding Carton. And that was a significant development for the village and for the church, so that in 1757 there were 700 people there. The 20th Earl of Kildare became the first Duke of Leinster. He married a young lady who was 15 when he married her, and they had 23 children. So he really was not going to be able to spend much time going around houses with a large family like that, so he more or less settled in Carton, and in 1770 he carried out the first major reconstruction of the church. And that was a major restoration. I would assume from what we know that it was the beginning of this large-scale building that we see around us here today. Obviously the roof mightn't have been as elegant as it is now, but it was the beginning of the rehabilitation of the church in Maynooth. And the church is the only one of that complex of buildings that has really survived. In 1780, Mr. Stoit built a house, an elegant house out here on the roadside, in a little enclave there called Riverstown Lodge, and he rented it to William Craddock. William Craddock was from a famous family of the established church. They were almost hereditary keepers of Marsh's library. And William Craddock and his wife lived there. He died in 1794. In the meantime, John Stoit's son had built the beautiful Stoit House. The council house had been knocked. The ruins and the little houses around them were still at the entrance, but the church was the first building of the place in terms of its longevity. These were new houses. Stoit houses were both new houses. And in 1795, of course, it became the College of St. Patrick that we know today as Maynooth College and University. In 1804, the second Duke died, the man who had supervised the development of Carton after his father died in 1773. And the new Duke then came in, and he actually lived a very long life. He had been born in 1749, and he was 55, I think, when he, not that long, but long for its period, when he died. And he died in 1804. The next Duke then, the third Duke, was probably the most important person in the history of the church, because when he came in, when his father died in 1804, he established the church as the place of worship, and in 1828 made probably the renovations that we live with today in large effect, and probably put in the organ. The organ was dated 1820, so in 1828 it would probably have been a new organ. But the other thing that he did was he wanted to have the keep at the back of the church, established as a vault for the family. And he did that when his wife died in 1859, even though in 1850 he had established a little cemetery out at Carton. And the problem with the cemetery out at Carton was that it began to be filled with very young people. The first 3 people to be buried there were his grandchildren, very young people. But in 1859, in any case, he decided that his wife should be buried in the vault that he was going to create, and he would be buried there as well. And also buried there would be the man who was really the major figure in the history of the church in the second part of the 19th century, who was George Dacre Blacker. And he was a great historian, and he wrote the history of the church and the rectors who had been here. He also wrote a few other books, but it was said that when he died, they had provided the full paraphernalia to carry him from his house, which was the rectory by now, because in 1748, the rector of Larrabryan gave up his house, the Duke of Leinster, and got some land and a house here. So the arrangement was that he would be taken from his house in a carriage to the church, which was not a great distance. But the number of people were so great in the street from all denominations that he was carried shoulder high from his house into the church. And he was then buried with his friend, the Duke, in the vault. In 1858, the church was renovated and extended to the tower. At that time, it was still a separate building, and it was now extended to the tower. So 1858 is probably the last proper renovation that we know of, apart from the one in 1990 that the parishioners carried out themselves. But the sad fact of the matter is we do not know, as far as I can gather, who the architect was. Even though there have been many other architectural involvements. The church at Mausoleum, for instance, was built as a family church in the 1860s, and a very young, or 1850s maybe even, a very young architect was involved. He died shortly afterwards. We know all about him, even though it's not as impressive a church as this. And there were other churches as well. For about 40 years in Tahadoe, there was a Church of Ireland. In fact, it was funny that the Church of Ireland and the Catholic Church, which was commissioned by a man called Dillon, whose executor was the Duke of Leinster. Dillon was a Catholic, and a Catholic church was built there. That's now the chapel of Lady Chapel, and the Protestant church was built there at the same time. The Protestant church didn't survive, the Catholic church did. And you have Larrabryan and you have Grange William. So you had a large number of small communities in the area, very historic, that came together then to create this wonderful permanent monument to history and to the times.
There are several people I would like to thank for helping me make this video. KILDARE Cultural Committee for their support and their training. Mr. Dennis Bergen, who was incredibly generous of his time and of his learning to be interviewed and to fill me in on all the gaps, and there are many gaps, that are there in my own knowledge of the place. To the men and women who have made this church what it is down through the years. But above all, to you and to God for being with me in this venture. God bless you and take care. Bye-bye.